Mr. Mayor, 2-minute warning. It is 6 p.m.
Great. And are we expecting all council members? I'm not seeing Rick or Diane. Okay. Welcome everyone to this special meeting on this evening of Monday, November 15th. I would like to call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, can you please call roll?
With pleasure, Mayor. Councilmember Goethals.
Here.
Councilmember Pappen.
Here.
Councilmember Lee.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Bonilla. He was on earlier. I'll make sure that.
He was in the closed session, so he may be switching back over.
Okay. And Mayor Rodriguez.
Here. Thank you. Due to the health orders in place at this time, we are holding meetings remotely. Information on how to provide public comment is explained at the bottom of each published agenda. When public comment is announced for the item you wish to comment on when signed on the Zoom, please use the raise your hand feature and you will be called upon at the appropriate time. If calling in via phone, please press *9 to raise your hand and then *6 to unmute yourself when called upon. These options for public comment will remain available until I close public comment for that specific item. We have two items on the agenda for this special meeting, and the first is a study session, auto repair establishments, zoning and parking regulations, and we have Senior Planner Rendell Bustos here to present to us.
Great. So if you could pull up the presentation. Perfect. Good evening, Mayor Rodriguez and council members. Rendell Bustos, Senior Planner in the Community Development Department, here to provide the staff presentation for this evening's study session on zoning and parking regulations on auto repair establishments. I wanted to start by outlining an agenda for the presentation. First, we'll start by outlining the background and timeline on this effort thus far. I'll then pass it along to our consultant to provide an update on the existing surveyed conditions. We'll then cover potential solutions and request input from the council based on those solutions. So regarding the timeline, the discussion around zoning regulations for auto repair uses began in 2012 after concerns were raised by community members, particularly on impact to public streets and residential neighborhoods by auto repair businesses. The council formally reviewed this item in 2016, after which staff, as well as a city consultant, conducted outreach to auto business owners and facilitated a permit program in 2017 for unpermitted auto lifts. The last council discussion on this item was a 2018 study session, in which one of the key takeaways from that meeting was to not have any new regulations with regard to parking standards drive existing establishments out of business. We then began to re-engage this effort in 2020 by engaging a consultant, Urban Planning Partners, or UPP. Prior to the COVID-19 shelter-in-place order, UPP conducted a field survey of existing conditions from late February to early March of 2020, which we'll go into more depth in a few moments. This effort was again put on hold due to the pandemic and staffing availability. But in 2021, staff reengaged this effort. So this evening, staff is hoping to use this study session to get some updated direction and updated feedback from the council to proceed. So with that, I'll pass it to Sophie Gable-Scheinbaum of UPP to discuss the work done since then and possible code amendments.
Great. Thank you so much, Rendell, and thank you everyone for having us here this evening. So as Rendell mentioned previously, we conducted site visits to all 108 auto repair businesses in San Mateo between February 28th and March 6th of 2020. So that was pre-pandemic and just pre-shelter-in-place conditions. In analyzing the results of our site visit survey and observations of existing conditions, we found that less than 20% of the 108 facilities conform with current zoning requirements. So as part of our observations, we noted the following. So while blockages of the public right-of-way and the issues of trash and debris were noted under sort of some of the original neighborhood complaints and concerns brought to council, we actually did not observe any major sidewalk blockages or issues with miscellaneous trash and debris. We also observed that time-restricted parking is quite limited in the areas surrounding Claremont Street and Railroad Avenue, and there's a lot more time-limited parking spaces available near businesses around Amphlett Boulevard and Palm Avenue areas. There are often many cars that looked like they had been parked on the streets for some time, and we were able to confirm this by both the condition of the cars, flat tires, dust, and rusting, as well as confirming this observation with business owners and employees at surrounding establishments. And lastly, we heard from several business owners and employees that they'll often use their work bays as spillover parking when needed. So after reviewing our survey results and analyzing best practices from 28 nearby cities and jurisdictions, we put forward these possible solutions. The first falls under the category of shifting parking requirements, and the other is addressed through additional enforcement agencies. Of the 28 nearby cities and jurisdictions analyzed for best practices, 23 used square foot ratios, not service bays, to determine parking requirements. So a potential solution would be to change the parking standard to per square foot standard versus a service bay standard, such as one parking space for every 200 square feet of business floor area, and as such have an opportunity to lower required parking numbers for these facilities. An additional measure could be to allow valet parking through a potential conditional use permit that would allow business owners to use non-striped on-site areas for parking and queuing to further eliminate any impact in the public right-of-way and surrounding parking. And other measures to consider include coordinating with code enforcement and San Mateo Police Department for more intensive enforcement related to nuisances and time-limited parking enforcement, and or to coordinate with Public Works to explore modifications to existing parking layout and configuration to further increase street parking supply.
Great, thank you, Sophie. Bringing it to the specific items that staff would like to receive direction on this evening. First is whether this effort is still a priority item for the council. We ask that the council consider this given the lack of complaints on these businesses since given the time that's elapsed. That's based on input from our code enforcement division, as well as from UPP's field survey. Should the council not consider this a priority, staff would retain the existing parking ratio as is, which is based on service bays, and would continue to monitor complaints and employ code enforcement as necessary as issues arise. Second, if code amendments are still a priority, would the council, and that's paragraph A, would the council like staff to further analyze the potential revised parking ratio through a parking study that perhaps is square footage based? And B, should staff engage with Public Works to increase on-street parking supply where possible, where street parking is limited? So with that, that concludes staff's presentation. We are available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rendell and Sophie. I'll bring it back to council for any questions we may have. And Deputy Mayor Bonilla has his hand up first. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I do have some questions. because this relates to an industry. Well, let me go back. We're going through a period of time in our history where we're going through multiple transitions. Climate change is bringing about transitions in how we generate and distribute energy. And the transportation industry is going through multiple changes. For 10 years here in San Mateo, we've been talking about wanting to transition into communities that are safe, walkable, bikeable, and to reduce the use of the single occupancy vehicle and get people onto trains, shuttles, buses, whatever kind of alternative sources that we could to reduce emissions and vehicles on the street, thereby making it safer for pedestrians and bicyclists. So I think you know where I'm going. At some point, the uses that we're talking about are going to become diminishing uses. Even though we can't see exactly where that's going to be from right now, we certainly can see by looking at the evolution of EVs that it's coming, and by the increasing uptake of the use of EVs, and by the looking for alternative fuels for every other mode of transportation, indeed, the very electrification of Caltrain. So I understand wanting to have some policies that work right now, but I think we should also be looking at and thinking about the transition away from these uses too. During the general plan update, certainly this is something we have to look at, is what can these sites be as these uses kind of go out of existence. You don't have to change the oil. You don't have to tune it up. It doesn't need so many, instead of thousands of moving parts, there are only really a handful comparably with an electric motor. And so that's the kind of thought I would like to provoke. My thinking right now on this is that, yeah, the square foot method seems to work better. Anyway, I'll cover that later. My question is, have we thought about transitioning and what that might look like? Are we making any plans for that? Thank you.
Sure, happy to take that. We haven't yet considered that, the reduced reliance on gas vehicles and whether that affects our code amendments. The changing conditions for fuel-based auto shops is something we can consider in our amendments should the council recommend such. So we'd look to the council for that policy direction. Something worth noting offhand is, EV vehicles themselves will still require maintenance, a different kind of maintenance, although they will still require unforeseen repairs caused by collisions. So the need for auto repair businesses may shift given the prevalence of EVs, but there'll still likely be a need for these kinds of businesses in the community. But we can look into that further should the council recommend such.
Yeah, autonomous vehicles should actually change that too. But anyway, thank you.
A follow-up question on that. Will this be looked at more in depth? It might not have been looked into it right now, but will it be in the general plan process? Is it on tap to be looked at more for alternative uses for these sites?
The focus of this code amendment was focused on finding the right parking standard, less about where these uses are permitted. I've looked to Zach Dahl, Deputy Director, to see if he has anything to add on the general plan effort.
That hasn't been identified as of yet, but that can definitely be added if there's interest to kind of explore that further. And there'll definitely be an opportunity as part of our land use element.
Thank you. Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, just piggybacking on that question, aren't we also doing a more sort of comprehensive parking analysis through the general plan process that's not necessarily industry specific as this, this case is, but it seems to me like we through the general plan process, there may be an opportunity to kind of fold this effort into a more a broader scope of analysis that could factor in a lot of uses and use types downtown and across the city. Is that the case?
For the general plan update, we are envisioning a downtown-wide parking study, but not a city-wide parking study that I'm aware of at this point. This topic before you tonight would affect automobile uses citywide.
And so what's the sort of the delta in terms of the percentage of businesses that fall within the downtown boundaries versus outside of them?
Rendell may be the best to answer that, but actually, I think most of our automotive uses are outside of downtown proper.
Yes, most of them are along streets such as South Amplet Boulevard, South Railroad Boulevard, South Claremont Street, and Palm Avenue. So mostly, east of the railroad.
I see. And just a clarifying question. It sounded, I mean, it sounded like a lot of the complaints coming from the public around nuisance, it could have been driven by abandoned vehicles that weren't necessarily associated with the businesses themselves. Am I understanding the presentation correctly, that that some of the abandoned vehicles were that were observed through this most recent analysis were completely independent and had nothing to do with the businesses that were being studied?
My take is that the complaints in 2012 were generally complaints on these businesses and their impact to the right of way. So abandoned vehicles, work occurring in the right of way, or a lack of street parking, arguably caused by these businesses. Sophie, do you have anything to add on the field survey?
I'd also add, in a few cases for the business owners that we talked to, they had the experience that folks would bring in their car for a repair, and if they couldn't afford to pay for it or just didn't want to come pick it up, it would just be left. I don't think that was the majority of cases, but that is something that we observed and we heard.
Thank you.
Councilmember Peppin.
I just have a question. If you go back a slide or two, you were asking about whether or not we wanted to allow valet on site. Is that
Yes,
right?
that is correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then that would mean like you could just sort of stack cars within your own business if there was no on-street parking available, but there were cars you were about to work on, right?
Right, exactly.
Yes, the thought is that there are vehicles that are dropped off for an extended period of time that are not being worked on, and they are shifted around when they are being worked on or not.
Shifted around on the street right now?
I think the field surveys were a mix of both. I know that there are probably a number of businesses that have adequate space to shift the vehicles on site. I think Sophie probably did observe some vehicles that seemed to have been parked there for an extended amount of time.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
there's definitely some spillover onto the street parking, and even when they sort of move cars around. And also, as mentioned before, some businesses did utilize their service bays themselves for parking, even when they weren't working on a car specifically.
Got it. So it is that in order to change anything at this point, we don't really have an accurate view of what's going on right now. Is that right? Most of our information is older.
The most recent survey is from March of 2020.
Oh, March of 2020. So that's not
just
too
right
long
before the pandemic.
right before the pandemic. And that was revealing what? A lot of still over parking on the streets and abandoned cars, or not really?
Yeah, so the existing conditions presented, let me just go back. In this slide are all from the survey findings from March of 2020. So these were things observed fairly recently, pre-pandemic. So that was, some cars left for extended amount of time, the work bays used as spillover parking, somewhat limited time restricted parking, but we did not observe much blockage of the public right of way or major debris or trash, which was something that had been flagged in previous surveys and complaints and concerns from the community.
Okay, so, and it would, if you go to slide again, it would require a change in our code if we were to allow this sort of valet parking on site to kind of stack more cars, keep them off the street, but on the site of the particular establishment that might be servicing the car.
Correct. One thing we could look at is integrating allowing possibly valet parking administratively. Right now, our code is written to allow valet parking through a use permit, but it's mainly for, valet parking for what we typically associate valet with, such as hotel, retail. We look to the council for the direction if they like to integrate valet into the actual parking ratio specifically for auto uses.
Okay, got it. Okay, I'm sorry, just kind of, I need a little more clarification. Okay, thanks, got it.
Deputy Mayor Bonilla, more questions? No? Okay. If there's no more questions from council, then I will open up public comment. If you'd like to speak on this, please raise your digital hand.
Mr. Mayor, I have no hands raised.
Okay, I'm going to close public comment and bring it back to council for any additional questions or comments for discussion. Is your hand still up, Deputy Mayor Bonilla? Would you like to start off? I think you're on mute right now.
So many buttons to push. Yeah, in the short term, I think we do need to have some regulations here, because I do travel along South Railroad and along Claremont, and even Railroad along off of First Avenue between Tilton and that area. And I do see sometimes some difficulties there, but nothing major anymore. I have seen some other things in the past that were like, double parked cars and trucks sticking out into the road and so forth. Pretty much the businesses there have organized themselves to be somewhat at least cognizant of the fact that these are public roads. So I think, though, that some of the common sense kind of recommendations that were made are good. I don't think we need to complete a parking study because I think we can use what we're able to observe right now. I think the idea of asking Public Works to maybe do some restriping, of asking the businesses to make better use of their on-site facilities for car storage, those kind of common sense remedies are perfect for right now. Like I say, I think that these areas of the city will be going through some transitions in some not too distant years. So I think those will suffice. Thank you.
Councilmember Pappen.
I would concur with both of those. I don't know that we necessarily need to do a parking study, but enhancing what one can do on their own property, as well as perhaps reconfiguring our street parking could help. And you're right, it may change ultimately, but I think right now these are businesses that definitely serve our residents, and those two items may allow us to coexist a little bit better than we have in the past.
Thank you. I concur with both of those comments, and I really don't have much more to add than that. I think they're well said. Do we have any more comments from Councilmember Lee or Councilmember Goltos? Okay. How did we do, staff? Do you need any more information from us or direction?
Yeah, if I could just summarize, I think the majority of the council sides with yes, needing regulations, no to doing a parking study, yes, engaging Public Works for immediate remedies. One follow-up question I'd have, since the council doesn't find the need for a parking study, is generally would the council recommend, one of the key takeaways from 2018 was to find a parking ratio that increases conformance and doesn't drive businesses out of business. My guess is that's still a priority. And two, would the council like our parking ratio to kind of land right in the middle, or the average of what sort of our adjacent cities would require, which is kind of what our current finding was?
Any thoughts on that? I personally agree with that middle range. That sounds reasonable to me.
I agree as well. if I can jump in.
Yes,
Mr.
please.
Mayor, sorry. I agree as well, and I think it makes sense to follow sort of the industry standard by square footage, and I guess I didn't get the sense that this would significantly impact the existing businesses, as many of them would be grandfathered in. And I think that that should be the case to not destabilize these businesses.
I'm seeing Councilmember Pappen here.
Yeah, I concur. I concur. I don't need to say
Yeah.
anything more. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay,
I think that's our comments.
great. Thank you. Anything that I missed either from city staff or UPP? Any feedback necessary now?
Are you-
Hearing none. I think that's it.
Okay,
Thank you, Mayor.
great. Thank you. A great presentation on all sides. All right, let me just pull up the next thing. Okay, so the next item is actually a closed session item. It's conference with legal counsel, existing litigation, workers' compensation. And before we go into closed session, I just wanted to, I'm not seeing any public attendees right now, but I wanted to give the public an opportunity to comment if they'd like before we go into closed session. I'm not seeing any hands. I'm not seeing anybody there. So we're going to go into closed session now, and we have our regular meeting at 7 p.m. Thanks. Bye.